All right, Erev Tov, everybody. We've got another double parsha, Achrei Kedoshim, and this seems to, I guess, cross the threshold between them in some sense, as it's listed as the second on Achrei and the first in Kedoshim, the holiness of Israel and the dignity of the disabled. The focus is on a pasuk from Parashat Kedoshim, from chapter 19 of Vayikra, often called by scholars the Holiness Code. This single chapter really includes many mitzvot of all different kinds that seem to surround the notion of what it takes to be kadosh. And here we go. When Leviticus lays out its vision for how Israel is to live a life of holiness, it includes the following charge. You shall not insult, lo tikalel, the deaf, or place a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall fear the Lord your God. I am the Lord. You can see it in context here in Leviticus chapter 19, the one which begins, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, Kedoshim tihiyu, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. And in the context of some mandates for ethical treatment of workers, that's the previous pasuk. We're told right here in verse 14, you shall not insult the deaf or place a stumbling block before the blind. You shall fear your God. I am Hashem. Lo tekalel cheresh v'lifnei iver lo titein michshol v'yareta me Elohecha ani Adonai. On the face of it, the two injunctions make for an odd pairing. As Robert Alter notes, there is both a common denominator and a logical discrepancy between these two prohibitions. On the one hand, both the deaf person and the blind person suffer from a disability that prevents them from perceiving that someone is exploiting their weakness in a nasty way, right? That's the common denominator, that their disabilities make it impossible for them to fully understand what's being done to harm them as it's being done. Yet on the other hand, abusing or verbally insulting a deaf person gratuitously humiliates him in a fashion that he himself, unhearing, may never become aware of. Whereas placing a stumbling block before a blind person causes him hurt of which he will immediately become aware. The blind person may not know where that hurt came from or whether it was intentional or not, but from the perspective of the consequences of the action in terms of inflicting pain of which the victim is conscious, right? There's a significant difference between the verbal insult of a deaf person and the stumbling block being placed before the blind person. I would suggest, says Rav Shai, that the disparity between the two cases may be intentional. Whereas one prohibition, placing a stumbling block before the blind, is concerned with physical harm, the other, insulting the deaf, is focused more broadly on disrespect, right? So we have, as always, when we see kind of two cases side by side, and we have this in Psalms when you have two poetic phrases side by side, are they attempting to sort of be different ways of getting at the same point? Are they complementary? Are they, oppositional in some way? And so I think Rav Shai here is taking the approach of complementary. They have overlapping themes, but are actually different in order to teach two different points. One is the injunction not to cause physical harm, and the other not to disrespect. Rabbinic tradition reads these prohibitions expansively. Okay, now he's going to sort of launch into, as he often does, a few different possible interpretations and then come back to question them. So starting with this one, Rabbinic tradition reads the prohibitions expansively, such that the deaf and the blind serve at least in part as illustrations of broader principles. To take the first part of the verse as an example, and that's, by the way, what he's going to do for the whole chapter. He really doesn't get into the case of not placing a stumbling block before the blind. He'll focus us in on not cursing the deaf. To take the first part of the verse, and I'll pick up where I left off. To take the first part of the verse as an example, thumbs up if I'm coming through. I'm getting some messages about my internet. Okay, thanks, Bracha. Thanks, everybody. Great. To take the first part of the verse as an example, the core prohibition is not on cursing the deaf person in particular, but on cursing any member of the Jewish people. Again, this is the rabbinic, keep in mind, this is the rabbinic interpretation, right? The biblical just is what it is. Don't curse the deaf person. But the rabbinic interpretation makes it much more expansive. A midrash teaches, "You shall not curse the deaf," quotes our verse. "Here I only learn about the deaf. From where do I know that it is forbidden to curse any person?" From a verse in Exodus 22 from Parashat Mishpatim. "Nor put a curse upon a ruler of your people, v'nasiba amcha lo ta'o." Since the phrase "of your people" seems superfluous in that verse, the sages conclude that any member of your people is included in the prohibition. So we have a midrash here on our pasuk, which puts it in conversation with a verse from Exodus and sort of has it coming all together to say, yes, the example being given here is not cursing the deaf, but this is part of a broader injunction not to curse anybody. The Talmud derives the same lesson differently. As Nachmanides understands it, the Talmud says, this is a passage from Sanhedrin, the Talmud says that the Torah prohibits cursing both the most eminent, judges and rulers, that's our verse from Exodus, and the least fortunate, the deaf, that's our verse here, members of society. The mention of those highest and lowest in the social hierarchy implies that the entire society is included. No one may be cursed. So in other words, whether you take that rabbinic midrash or this interpretation in the Talmud, somehow when we read this verse about not cursing the deaf, we put it together with the verse about not cursing the prince, and we, through one mechanism or another, come out with the understanding that it all contributes to an overall understanding that the Torah is trying to get at about not cursing anyone. Maimonides codifies this expansive interpretation. He begins by emphasizing the prohibition on cursing a judge or a ruler, but then he adds, it is not only forbidden to curse a judge or a ruler, but rather anyone who curses a member of the Jewish people is punished. As scripture says, you shall not curse the deaf. Why then does the Torah mention the deaf in particular? To teach that even though he does not hear the curse, and therefore is not distressed by it, the one who curses is nevertheless punished, right? So if we're trying to say don't curse anybody, then why does in Exodus and here in Leviticus do we give these two examples? Because we want to, start with the maybe obvious case in Exodus, not cursing a judge or a ruler, and then coming all the way to the less obvious case here in Leviticus and Vayikra and our Parashah and Kedoshim of not cursing even a person who the curse ostensibly wouldn't harm. Maimonides' conclusion is striking. On his interpretation, Leviticus invokes the deaf person to show that cursing even a deaf person is forbidden, right? Certainly a ruler and even a deaf person. And yet I wonder, says Rav Shai, might the point of the verse be the opposite? Namely that cursing a deaf person especially is forbidden. Okay, so now he's summarized what he understands to be the rabbinic interpretation of this verse, which is not to read it alone, but to read it together with a verse that prohibits cursing leaders, and say that what we get out of this is an expansive prohibition on cursing, and even a step further through Maimonides, which is that the case of the deaf person is the sort of what's the best way to describe it? The one that we might think was the least big deal, and yet the verse is coming to include it, but it's the least big deal. And now Rav Shai wants to argue at some level the opposite. Right? On one level, of course, the expansive interpretation of the verse seems noble. After all, no one should be subject to being cursed or ridiculed. And I want to pause here to look for a moment at footnote 130. Where he says, but see, by way of comparison, Babylonian Talmud, Sanhedrin 85a. And we're going to do that for a moment. In Babylonian Talmud, Sanhedrin 85a, the Gemara interprets slightly differently. When it says, Nasiba amcha lo ta'ol, right, nor curse a ruler of your people, the Gemara was also wondering, why does it say ba'amcha amongst your people. That was the superfluous phrase which allowed the rabbinic tradition to say that it refers to any member of your people. Now the Gemara says, Be'oseh ma'aseh amcha. This prohibition only applies to someone who performs an action of your people, someone who behaves in the way that your people should be behaving. As the Koren Steinsaltz interpretation puts it, an action befitting a Jew. There is no prohibition against cursing one whose actions are inconsistent with the conduct appropriate for a Jew. So I think Rav Shai wanted to point this out in the footnotes, just to say, even while we're making the claim and accepting the premise that this expansive interpretation, that no one should be cursed, is on the table, there is also a strand in rabbinic tradition which seems to go in a slightly different direction and say you have to accord with a certain standard of behavior to be, worthy of not being cursed. And some people who don't accord with that standard of behavior, the prohibition against cursing them does not obtain. So that's a sort of a different view, which is less expansive in a particular way. And so not that interpretation, but our interpretation that no one should ever be cursed seems noble. And yet, and I think this is really the crux of Rav Shai's argument, the thing I think to think about, a general challenge to think about. And yet this inclusive approach runs the risk of effacing the Torah's main concern, which is to protect the powerless and easily exploited. I'll just read that again. The inclusive approach runs the risk of effacing the Torah's main concern, which is to protect the powerless and easily exploited. And he parenthetically says, this raises a basic exegetical problem. How do you read and interpret expansively without losing sight of the primary parties being spoken about? Right? I think we think about this, the example that comes to mind, not just about interpretation, but about expansiveness and inclusivity, is the liturgical debate over a modification to the last line of the Kaddish. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu, v'al kol Yisrael bimru amen. The one who makes peace on high should make peace, on us and on all of Israel, and let us say amen. And in some communities, that liturgy has been expanded to be more inclusive and say, hu yaseh shalom aleinu, v'al kol Yisrael, v'al kol yoshvei tevel, and on all dwellers of the earth. It's a beautiful wish, and why should we not wish for peace, not just on high and on us and on all Israel, but also on all people? And Rav Avi, though, sometimes says, if I love everyone as much as I love my family, how much do I love my family, right? And so the question, I think it reminds me of this question. It's not that we don't also wish peace for all people, but if we can't single out our own people in our prayers sometimes, then do we in some way dilute our message? It's a subject worthy of debate, and I think that's Rav Shai's point here, which is that this interpretive approach of the rabbis that says no one should be cursed is very powerful, but then we lose sight of the fact that maybe the verse is really trying to zero in on one particular group of people that shouldn't be cursed. And if we just say don't curse anybody, maybe we lose our opportunity to zero in on a particularly vulnerable group of people, which he argues that the concern for the welfare of that group of people, the powerless and easily exploited, is the Torah's main concern. And by being expansive, do we lose that? So that's the question, and I think the crux of his argument in this essay. The conclusion of the verse, I think, is telling, and I'm going to go one more paragraph and then pause. The conclusion of the verse, I think, is telling. But fear the Lord your God. Remember, we saw it. Lo tekalel cheresh v'lifnei iver lo titein michshol v'yareta me Elohecha. Fear your God. I am God. Jacob Milgram, and for the third time already, we're only 4 or 5 weeks in, for the third time already, we'll see Rav Shai showing us a close reading of something that we haven't always paid close attention to, and how it shifts our understanding. Jacob Milgram, quoted before, wrote the Anchor Bible commentary on Leviticus, an incredible scholarly work with many fresh insights, observes that this phrase appears only in verses dealing with the exploitation of the helpless, the elderly, later on in this very chapter, Leviticus 19:32, and indebted Israelites vulnerable to usury and enslavement. This is at the end of the book of Vayikra. Is that true? No, it's in Parashat. Might be. It's actually in Parashat Bahar. Yes, at the end of the book, where we have a couple of places where we're told. I can jump right over to the passages in the concordance, where we're told, don't oppress your neighbor, don't take in charge interest, don't be harsh with him. And in each place it says v'yareta me'elohecha. You should translate it as fear your God. Okay, so this phrase fear your God appears lots of places, but in this formulation, as we're about to see, it appears rarely, and it appears specifically in verses dealing with the exploitation of the helpless. To bolster the point, Milgram points out that yarei min, which is used here, is not synonymous with yarei et, which is used frequently elsewhere. Right? We say in places, et Hashem Elokecha tira, revere the Lord your God. But here we're being told v'yareta, not et Hashem, but me Elokecha. Something about fearing from as opposed to fearing or revering, as explained here. Whereas the latter, yarei et, the much more frequent formulation in the Torah, means to revere. The former, yarei me, means to fear punishment. Mayor Gruber goes one step further, suggesting that min may imply lifnei, in the presence of. Your crime, which you think is committed surreptitiously, is known by God. Rachai will come to you in just a minute. The point in each case is that although the vulnerable are often politically impotent, they do have a protector, God. In our verse, the Torah wishes to remind us that although the deaf does not know he was insulted, or the blind who hurt him, God does know and will punish accordingly. So in other words, we're not just being told here, don't insult the deaf or place a stumbling block before the blind. Fear God in the most sort of lofty sense, but we're being told on guard, because God is paying attention to what you're doing and will punish you. And I just point out this distinction is one which appears many places in Kabbalistic and in pietistic and literature of character development and improvement. One of the classic books that's studied in the school of Musar, of self-improvement, is the book Mesilat Yesharim, and in chapter 24 he clarifies this distinction. He talks about two types of fear, which are effectively three, but fundamentally he's talking about two types. The first type is fear of punishment, yirat ha'onesh, and the second is fear of God's exaltedness, yirat ha'romemut, of which fear of sin is the second part therein. And he develops this idea. The motivation for not doing something wrong can be at the most base level, fear of punishment. At the more exalted level, it's you revere God, and God doesn't want you to do it, and you would never want to do something that God didn't want you to do, even if you had no fear that God was going to punish you as a result. You just want to accord with God's will because God is so exalted and God. And what we're being shown here is that distinction plays out biblically between the term yarei et, which is the fear, the awe or reverence of God's greatness, and yarei min, which is the fear of punishment. Okay, pause here for a moment and come first to you, Bracha. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm seeing it in a slightly different perspective.
Great.
Which is that the fear from God is alerting you to that the people that you're thinking are nothing, and what's the big deal, are the ones. It's a reminder that these are the ones that have the Tselem Elokim inside them. That there's something to fear from who they actually are that you did not yet see.
Beautiful. So that sort of invoking God is also invoking the image of God, and be conscious that you, in the same way you revere me, you should revere, honor, and have a certain awe towards these human beings as any human beings, but maybe singling out because there's some way, and this is completely the direction Rosh Hashanah is going to go, although not using the reading that you're using, which is very beautiful, which is you're somehow have an inclination not to see the divinity in a person with a limitation or a disability of some kind or a challenge. And so the verse is trying to awaken us to that. It's beautiful. Great. Lance?
Okay, my perspective, while I think that all of this makes perfect sense and is quite good, my perspective emphasizes verses 33 and 34. Would you like me to read them?
Sure.
Okay. When a foreigner, a stranger, resides among you in your land, do not mistrust them or him. The stranger residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love the stranger as yourself. Love the stranger as yourself, for you were strangers in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Okay. Now, for me, while I'm the last person in the world who would want to attack the deaf or the blind in any way, shape, or form, but for me, the concept of the stranger is key in a larger context. How many of you have read They Must Go by Rabbi Meir Kahana? Nobody? Really? Okay. Well, that text is held against Kahana and all of his friends, I guess, including Gavir and all the right-wingers, as radical extremism and so forth. But if you read the book to the end, you will find that Rabbi Kahana cites the Talmud, and he cites the 7 Noah laws, one of which is bloodletting. This passage that we've just read is really the way that you can let them stay. And by that I mean, if the stranger, if you are welcoming the stranger, and if you are loving the stranger as yourself, that changes the world, changes the whole world. Because what I see, if I look around, I think you'll all agree with me, is that just about everybody hates somebody else. Mm-hmm. In other words, Muslims call people they don't like infidels, and Russians call people they don't like Ukrainians, or vice versa. I mean, you have in Yemen, you have all around the world today, North Koreans, South Koreans, the whole thing. You also have, sadly, Jews who hate other Jews, Jews who exclude other Jews. And the same thing with among Christians, and even certainly the Sunnis and the Shiites are an example. Although with Saudi Arabia and Iran getting rid of it, I don't understand that. But anyway, and it seems to me that this is the key passage. And if you think about it, cursing really, for me, would mean excluding. There's a book called The Dynamics of Exclusion, and it seems to me that that's what's really at the root of the problems that we have in the world today. For me, anyway, it's my take on it. What is your take, Ralph Stephen?
Wow, that's a powerful argument, and it resonates very strongly. I think the need to not other or marginalize or exclude is central. I think it comes back to Bracha's point about seeing the humanity in the other, and I really do think that when we just stereotype or prejudge or caricature each other without just knowing each other, we contribute a lot towards the problems. I don't want to oversimplify. There's certainly more than that, but I think that's I absolutely think so. And the Torah's concern with the place of the stranger, I think reflects that. So a great important reflection.
But I'd just like to make one more point, sure. And that is the flip side, which is to say that everyone is the same, everyone is equal, is equally wrong. In other words, we need to treat the stranger as ourselves, but we also need to treat the stranger as coming from a different culture, a different situation,
That's right.
and approaching the stranger in that way.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's what Maurice Merleau-Ponty calls the truly liberal position. Sartre, for example, also talks about the conservative position, which is sectarian is I, you, we're the good guys, you're the bad guys. And the liberal position, which is everybody is good, everybody is bad, we're all one. Okay, and I disagree with both positions, but it's very difficult, very difficult.
Well said.
To
Thank
live
you.
that way.
All right,
Okay.
here we go. We'll come to the latter portion now. This approach too understands the deaf and blind as representative of a broader category. But the broader category is those who are potentially defenseless, not humanity or the Jewish people as a whole. As Bible scholar J. Sklar writes, in our verse, the deaf person and the blind person represent all those at some physical or social disadvantage, whether physically or mentally challenged, poor, widowed, or displaced, which, when you think about it, can expand to include a lot of people. So it is still a broader category, but it's hard to know exactly where to divide that line. But that's the way of looking at it. That's what this verse is pointing us towards. As we have just seen, this interpretation is much more in keeping with the thrust of the verse itself than the more universalizing approach. So again, coming back to the interpretive frame, what Rav Shai is trying to point out to us is there's good reason, there's good motivation for whatever the rabbinic approach is at a textual level. Noticing you have a verse about not cursing the deaf and a verse about not cursing a ruler or a judge, and you can go in two ways there. You can sort of say, wow, those must be the ends of the extremes of a big spectrum, and everything is meant to be included. Or no, those must be particular categories, and there may also be a reason not to curse anyone, but there are special issues going on in each of these cases, and they deserve to be highlighted. And he wants to go in that latter direction, and then talk about what's important to highlight about the case of the deaf, and is it only that, or is it a slightly more expansive category, which is those who are disadvantaged in some particular way. By now, some readers may be tempted to protest. Now we come to sort of feel, in the arc of a typical Rav Shai essay, right? We come now to the question of, how do we bring this forward to the modern day? Is it still relevant? If not, how can we make it relevant? And if yes, how is it relevant? So by now, some readers may be tempted to protest. Does the Torah really need to tell us not to insult the deaf or trip the blind? What kind of human being would do that anyway? In this day and age, at any rate, haven't we progressed beyond that kind of deplorable behavior? Maybe not. Right now we hear the echo from last week about infant mortality. Is that gone from our world? Maybe better in some parts of our world, but maybe not in others. Right? Maybe not. Karen Pfizer writes that people with disabilities are often easy targets for physical and verbal abuse. Shocking as it is, many are victimized in their own homes. On the street, it is not unusual for wheelchair users to be taunted, beaten, and robbed. Even when disabled people are not overtly abused, their dignity and personhood are continually assaulted. Again, coming to Bracha's point. They are ignored, infantilized, treated as if they weren't there, spoken about in the third person. Will you look after him? Will his chair fit in the elevator? Pfizer's final point is essential. Even when we do not actively denigrate or ridicule someone who is deaf or blind, we may still be complicit, consciously or otherwise, in seeing them as less human than the able-bodied, or as less than human altogether. One of the most anguished complaints I have heard over the years from students living with disabilities is that they are consistently rendered invisible by others. Often, it is important to add, by others who would be horrified at the thought that they had been guilty of mistreating others. People who consider themselves ethical, good people unwittingly still do this. Being well-intentioned and being oblivious to the actual lives, experiences, and needs of people living with disabilities are not mutually exclusive, right? You may be well-intentioned and also oblivious. which is why learning to listen to the voices of those so often rendered voiceless is a crucial moral and religious imperative. In cataloging the 613 commandments, Maimonides interprets the prohibition on cursing the deaf as a signature example of the Torah's concern with human character and virtue. Now we're coming not to Maimonides' interpretation in the code, the Mishnah Torah that he referenced earlier, but now here in Maimonides' compilation of the 613 commandments called the Sefer HaMitzvot, the Book of Commandments. We might have thought, he writes, that the Torah prohibits cursing another Jew only when the one who is cursed hears it, because of the shame and pain he endures. But since a deaf person does not hear the curse and is not pained by it, there is no sin involved in that case. Our verse works to undercut that line of thought, specifically prohibiting cursing the deaf. Why? Maimonides continues, because the Torah is concerned not only with the one who is cursed, but also with the one who curses. The potential character flaw the Torah writes about in this instance, according to Maimonides, is gearing oneself up for revenge and growing accustomed to being angry. Right? So for Rambam, the prohibition on cursing the deaf is not because of any harm it's really going to bring to them. They are not going to be aware of it, but it's because of the ethical flaw it allows for in the cursor. And that flaw for Maimonides is kind of allowing oneself to get worked up, to want to wish harm and respond angrily to another, or initiate an angry expression towards another. There's something powerfully compelling about Maimonides' insistence that the Torah in general, and our verse in particular, are concerned with human character. And yet I am not sure that the character failing the Torah works against here is a proclivity to anger and vengeance. Meaning Rav Shai is saying, I agree with the first half, that there's a character development on basis for the prohibition on cursing the deaf person. But what is that character development that the Torah is concerned with? He'll say, in light of what we've seen, it seems more likely that the Torah's focus is on the temptation to see people with disabilities, and perhaps the vulnerable more generally, as less human than we, and therefore as less deserving of dignity and protection. That's what the Torah is trying to heighten our awareness of when it tells us not to curse someone who is deaf. In this context, it's important to pay careful attention to the Hebrew word for insult, kilel. The root, kuf, lamed, lamed, just see it again here in the text itself. Lo tikalel, kuf, lamed, lamed. The root kuf lamed lamed also means to be light, kal. In its prohibition on verbally abusing the deaf, the Torah is also making a stronger, deeper point, warning us not to treat the deaf person lightly, as if he or she has no importance. The opposite of kal is kaved, kaf, kuf, vet, dalid, to treat as weighty, or more conventionally, to treat with respect. So now Rav Shai is expanding the way we're interpreting the verb, not just don't curse, but implicit in that is don't treat lightly, don't view with diminishment, treat as insignificant the deaf person. In fact, and the opposite then is to treat them kaved, with gravitas, with seriousness, with respect. What the Torah seeks to instill, in other words, is kavod, respect for people who are deaf, people who are blind, and those with any one or more of countless other disabilities. So again, a quick summary. We zero in on this pasuk as a somewhere in the center of the chapter on Kedoshim Tihiyu, on what it means to be holy. Notice the question of the relationship between the two thou shalt nots, cursing a blind person and cursing a deaf person and placing a stumbling block before a blind person. What's the relationship between them? And focusing in on the notion of disrespect for the deaf person in that one. Looking at the rabbinic tradition, which in concert with a verse in Exodus about not cursing the leader, reads these two together to really be the kind of poles of an overall prohibition against cursing, and that's sort of what we're supposed to think about when we see these verses. we appreciate the expansiveness of that prohibition, but we wonder if something is lost in that expansiveness, which is the particular attention to the parties that the verses themselves are mentioning, coming all the way to the kind of opposite conclusion of the Rambam, who says, we mention the deaf person because that's sort of the least big deal in cursing, but we want to remind you still not to do that, and now offer the opposite interpretation. That's the biggest deal. The most important party not to curse is the deaf person. And we deepen that understanding by noticing that verb and preposition pairing, Yareta me Elohecha, that unusual language, which is always comes in the place where people who are subject to or vulnerable to exploitation are mentioned, and the notion of they don't have a protector that you are fearful of, so you should be aware that God is watching out and will punish you for that wrongdoing, for that taking advantage. And now we zero in on that particular category as the deaf person representative of those who have a disability, a challenge, a limitation that could be exploited. And more broadly, the challenge being not seeing their full humanity in the way that we are inclined to see our own full humanity. And that meant coming finally to the revisiting the verb, lo tekalel, and seeing this as an injunction not to treat lightly, not to diminish the humanity of, but instead to focus on the weightiness, equal weightiness of the deaf or limited person or person with challenges, alongside you as an equal. Any last thoughts before we sign off? Steve, please.
Yes, I think this concept compares favorably with modern criminal law. If you point a gun at a sleeping person, the law says that you have not committed an assault because the person you point the gun at is not aware of this action. On the other hand, if you point an unloaded gun at a person, that person is placed in fear of his life. So even though it's unloaded, it's an assault, it's a crime. So in the case where you point a gun at a sleeping person, you are cursed because this action is a horrible thing to do. So, thank you.
Beautiful insight, and appreciating the dimension of the character of the perpetrator in a sense, as a concern of the Torah.
Right.
Great, thank you. Any other thoughts? Okay, great. Thanks again to everybody for your extensive patience, and wishing everyone a good end to the Yom HaAtzmaut extended day, and look forward to being back on to Monday night next week, and hopefully on time.
Thank you.
Love to Mom and Dad. Good night to all. Bye.
Good night.